chance anything.
Oh,
Mhm.
that's
Wow, I
new.
never heard that before.
Me neither, Peggy.
Zoom keeps changing.
It does. It
You have to
does.
sign something?
Well, I mean, you know, you're going to be the star of stage and screen now after being on this. So, yeah. What did you say, Peggy, before that? No.
Nothing I can remember.
Okay. All right. So let's rock and roll, and then you can make people feel like, oh, they really missed something powerful and fabulous. So, yeah. Do you want to go ahead and share the screen, Elizabeth?
Sure.
And if you had to go to the beginning.
Yep.
Okay.
And I think I can present.
Yep. Okay. This is just our landing slide a little bit, but
Here we are.
Yeah, here we are. You know, just keeping in consist. This is just I took the screenshot from a picture that's on our webpage from on the church, but just the reminder that rejecting racism and is part of being the church, and this is a continuation of our work and our walk together. So just sort of situating this. Go ahead. So today's what I'm gonna attempt to do tonight is just frame a little bit some language, some ideas that sometimes get a little muddled when we're having these discussions, and then just tell you how we're thinking about structuring the summer, and then send you off with well wishes, and we will meet up sometime in the fall face to face to talk about things. So this quote, do the best you can until you know better, then when you know better, do better. I like to start with that just because I think that in the ways that we have all, if you've grown up in the United States in particular, and most of you have heard me say this before, you've consumed racism and racialized ideas with your morning oatmeal, right? And so part of the work is unlearning, and it's a lifetime of work. So once you learn a little more, then you do a little better, and you learn a little more and you do a little better. And it's not necessarily, right, this also I'm saying like this is a linear path, but there's all kinds of ways that we'll mess up. And so the idea being tonight is just to frame some ways that might be helpful for us thinking about this. So that's where we're headed. So next slide, please. So a couple things about racial literacy, which is really what we're doing and the kinds of work that one piece of what we're doing with this summer reading program. So it helps us develop understandings of how race shapes the social, economic, political, and education experiences of individuals and groups. And you'll see in the lower right corner a screen grab from Sesame Street, actually. And in the, we're going to share this slideshow with you in a little bit, but in the notes, I also have links to this. One of the things that Sesame Street has just launched this year is racial literacy for little ones. And the reason I put that on there is that, again, this is lifelong work. This puppet show came out sometime this spring, this interaction about Elmo in the sort of Elmo's the little red puppet, in case those of you are very distant from children's studies.
This is Elmo.
Elmo is asking, well, why is your skin brown? And this sort of conversation about how do we have fluent conversations about race and racial identity without it being this moment, right? And we can do that across the board at all ages. Next slide, please. So three things that I think we can do this summer as we're doing our independent sort of choose your own adventure is continue to think about the recognizing race as a contemporary rather than a historical problem. And I say that because one of the books that I am leading, Stand from the Beginning, the history of racist, complete history of racist ideas, that book takes us through how we've created race, we recreate race, and we recreate racism to modern day. So we do need to understand the historical context, but if we leave it in the past, right, then that doesn't get us anywhere. A belief in the constructedness and socialization of racial identity, and I'll talk more about that in just a second, And then the development of language practices through which to discuss race, racism, and anti-racism. I would say that one of the barriers that, or I guess one of the areas of development that I think we could do as a church community is think about how can we increase our fluency in talking about race and racism so that we're not falling all over ourselves to try to find the right word. Instead, we're learning together. And I think that this summer offers that opportunity to increase that. Next slide, please. So just a reminder, and this is, some of you were with me this summer, and some of you last summer, I meant, some of you weren't. One of the things when we think about the construction of racial identity and the construction of race is that, and I think, and I'll break this down more in just a second, but race is the child of racism, not the father. That is to say that race, as we understand it, has been constructed to justify racist practices, policies, and ways of being in the world. So that fixed category of race actually doesn't exist. It exists in our world for the sole purpose of replicating racism. Next slide, please.
Wow.
So again, yeah, Paige, did you have something?
No, I'm just going, wow. Yeah.
um,
Sorry.
I'm going fast, sorry. So we can, maybe I'll get through and then we can go back to just so if folks have questions. So the concept of race that is, as we deploy it in the United States, withstands no serious scientific rigor. There are no distinct races of humankind. What we think we're seeing when we're seeing race are these phenotypical markers, right? That sort of say, this is the container I'm in, but it's not a biological, like you are a separate race of human being. Next slide, please. Just to put a little science in this. I think I put that in, nope, I didn't. I'll add that later. But even though we have this, we can accept, or that we should accept that race is a social category, it still has, that is, it is this mirage, right? It is this way, our organizing principle, but we can't look away from it, right? So race is a mirage, but one would do well to see, while never forgetting it is a mirage, never forgetting that it's the powerful light of racist powers that makes it a mirage. So it is this sort of mind game, or some scholars call it this notion of racecraft, right? That creates this idea of race that replicates systems of racism. One of the biggest ways that we see this is through the concept of whiteness. And this I want to spend a little bit of time with because I think it makes folks maybe the most uncomfortable. So you will hear scholars, you'll hear anti-racist folks like myself say something to the tune of, we need to abolish whiteness, which is very different than saying we need to abolish white people. I am not for genocide in any form, way, shape, or form, right? But when we think about whiteness, we need to decouple it from what we think of as, well, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So whiteness, the way that I would invite us to think about it, which might be helpful as we work on our own anti-racism, those of us that walk the world as white people, whiteness is defined as an ideology untied to certain bodies, but an articulation of disparate elements, some racial, some not. This is all, you can tell I'm getting a little heady on you tonight, in order to build a racial cosmology that benefits whites, or those that can pass for white, in absolute ways, and minority groups relative only to one another. I'm going to talk about that term minority in a little bit. Whites recruit class, gender, and sexual interests into the general phenomenon to specify, specifically into the logic of whiteness. For instance, white women, working class whites, gay and lesbian whites, disabled whites, groups that suffer in their own right, despite their whiteness, are consoled by the promise of this ideology of whiteness, that this is something that we can sort of cloak ourselves in. So let me go to the next slide, and then I want to pause. So this is the part that I think gets even stickier. So as such, whiteness, there is no sort of essence of whiteness. We're not going to define what can and cannot be considered white, because the membership of what can be incorporated into whiteness has changed over time, right? So like capitalism, and this is from a different article, so I'm not going to go into my critique of capitalism and how it works at racism tonight. Anyway, whiteness has no ultimate sense of loyalty and cares primarily about perpetuating race relations with whiteness at the top of the hierarchy. So throughout history, we see different groups petitioning to be considered white, right? So that they can get access to things like voting rights, owning property, and all those other things. So we talk about who can be considered white, who cannot be considered white, when that can be revoked, and how whiteness operates to sort of, again, replicate systems of power. So I want to pause for a second because it's a lot of words. Does that make any sense?
I just wanted to say one quick thing, Tara. Welcome to Judy and Helen for joining us post choir. Thanks for being with us. Tara is just giving us a wonderful kind of 101 kind of before we launch off onto our reading this summer. So if you're just joining, that's what we're doing. We just started a couple slides ago. So it's all good. We're going to share this slideshow later.
Yeah, welcome everybody. We're just sort of laying a few things out. I'm
Yep.
going to go to the next slide because I think that also might help us conceptualize this. James Baldwin writes about the ways that America became white, right? The people who, as they claim, settled the country became white. So that notion, and if you choose the Ibram Kendi stamp from the beginning book, you get a better sense of how this whiteness, was sort of born because of the necessity of denying Black presence and justifying Black subjugation. No community can be based on such a principle. In other words, no community can be established on a genocidal lie. I talked before, that's okay. I talked before about that notion of abolishing whiteness. That's what I mean by that. Like if it only is rooted in destruction, racism, subjugation, it doesn't really have any traction for us, which is different to say, earlier this year, we were in a book group with Andy, and I was in a breakout group. I think it was with Nancy Foster, and Nancy was talking about, well, I guess there are certain cultural traditions I can no longer honor. And then we talked about the difference between, I would be willing to bet that the cultural traditions that you all have in your lives and in your families and have much more to do with your ethnic identity than it has to do with, well, we do that because we're white. So we think about Scotch and Irish and German and all those different ways that we identify the things that we would say, these are part of my family traditions. I would bet that abolishing whiteness doesn't impact a lot of that, right? That those cultural traditions are not what I'm talking about. So one of the ways that whiteness is replicated and the ways that we replicate racism is through this notion of implicit bias, which is the next slide. And so again, I'm just dropping a few ideas for you to think about as you're reading this summer. Also referred to as unconscious bias. It's a process of associating stereotypes or attitudes toward categories of people without conscious awareness, which can result in actions and decisions that are at odds with one's conscious beliefs about fairness and equality. In other words, it's not this like I'm actively trying to alienate this person or replicate this healthcare system that doesn't serve large swaths of people groups. And yet, who do I value? Where do I look to for my knowledge? All of those other things. Next slide, please. Couple terms I want us to think about that you might see. This is BIPOC, or sometimes people call it BIPOC. This is an acronym used to refer to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I would capitalize Black there. I was cutting and pasting. So, and I would also capitalize people of color. This is what happens when you put a slideshow together 15 minutes before you talk to people. Anyway, it's based on the recognition of collective experiences of systemic racism. As with any identity term, it's up to individuals to use this term as an identifier. The other term you'll hear frequently is people of color. And so both of those terms can be used somewhat interchangeably. The best thing to do, however, is to refer to people specifically as they want to be referred to, right? In absence of that, we can use collective terms. So that's one idea. The next idea, and this is where I'm pushing, you're great, Elizabeth. Yeah. The next idea that I'm going to introduce us to or have us think about is this notion of a co-conspirator. This is the notion of someone who supports a group other than one's own in terms of racial identity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Co-conspirators acknowledge disadvantage and oppression of other groups, take risks and supportive actions on their behalf, commit to reducing their own complicity or collusion in oppression, and invest in strengthening their own knowledge and awareness of oppression. Many of us are engaging in that this summer, in this sort of strengthening your own knowledge and awareness. The thing that's different between a co-conspirator, and you might hear a term called ally, is a co-conspirator is in it to win it, right? You're there alongside folks. The other thing that is important about a co-conspirator is you do have to play the role of the listener. You're not conscribing what the help is, right? You're not coming from the outside saying, this is how I'm going to fix this for you, X group of people. In other words, you're engaging with your own knowledge, and you're also holding back. You don't have to be center of that change, but you're there to walk alongside. Next slide.
Paige?
I'm just struggling a little in understanding this because co-conspirator sounds like a negative term, and conspirator is traditionally a negative term. So I'm in trouble with it a little.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reason I introduce it is because you probably will see it more in work around abolitionism around, and in anti-racist groups. The idea is that you are, I mean, so when we think about conspiring, right, you're usually trying to break something down, right? You're going to do something that is a way that you're not necessarily going to play by the rules that are set up. And it's certainly not a term that I would expect people have to like, I'm going to label myself that, but I did want you to be aware of that folks are moving in a lot of social justice circles away from the term ally because it feels a little too passive, and conspirators like, I'm in it to win it. But with any of this, and Paige, I appreciate you saying that, because with any of this, this is terminology just so we know, and some of it's going to work and some of it's going to be like, you know what, I'm going to stick with ally, or I'm not going to label what I'm doing. I'm just in the walk along. So thank you for that.
Tara, I see it as a problem of connotation rather than etymology. And if you really look at the etymology, you are breathing with the group that you are promising to help.
You're conspiring with them for good change in the world, right?
Yeah, that's how I'm seeing it. Yeah, Peggy, did you want to add to that? No? Okay. Yeah. I mean, when I came across the term initially in a group, I really found it useful. So again, it's just.
Yeah. And I'm really happy to know about it. I think what was coloring it for me is hearing conspiracy theory so much,
Right?
that has tainted that word for me. Yeah.
And I'm actually glad that it has tainted that. I mean, not that the word conspiracy now has a little bit of a. All right.
Sorry, real quick, but you know how like John Lewis said, like get into good trouble. It's like, let's conspire to like upend this system. Let's get into it. That's kind of how I'm looking at it from a. Yeah.
Awesome. And this is, I think, and I, you know what, I didn't put her name in because this is given, the credit for this is called this Aboriginal Activist Collective, but there's actually a woman, and I want to send her name because I think it's also important that we honor the space and who is bringing forth this wisdom. But I think this embodies that notion of co-conspirator. If you come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let's work together. And that notion that we're on this walk together, that whole concept of if you suffer, I suffer, that's part of when I think of what motivates that notion of co-conspirator. Next slide, please. So anti-racist education, right? And this is anti-racist education, despite being the buzzword of the last year, it is not new. It is not a new theory. It is not a new way of arranging oneself around ideas, but it's this theory of learning of action to help us do the important work of dismantling racism. It explicitly highlights critiques and challenges institutional racism. It addresses how racist beliefs and ideologies structure one-on-one interactions and personal relationships. It examines and challenges how institutions support and maintain disadvantages and advantages on racial lines. And I want to go a little further into this. One of my goals today was to share a few resources. So next slide, please. So the Center for Anti-Racist Education was just launched about 4 months ago. But I think one of the things that they're doing, especially for educators, and that's my background, is providing very concrete ways for us to think about how to do this work. Their first principle is affirm the dignity of humanity of all people, right? So it's not about necessarily just tearing down, it's about honoring everybody that shows up, possibility in all students, and ensure that no one feels unsafe, invisible, or unheard. And you can flip this if you don't want to use the word school. Think about whatever community you find yourself in. You can keep going with me. We talked a little bit about this. It is about embracing historical truths, right? So you're embracing hard history. But also, and this is Peggy, for those of you that came a little bit later, Peggy was talking about the children's books that I included in suggestions of the summer reading. One of the things that I think that we as some, by me, I mean we, those of us that work in anti-racist education sometimes get wrong is when we embrace historical truths, we forget to tell the stories of resistance and joy. And so if we're only telling a single story of oppression, we're also missing the boat. So part of that embracing historical truths is seeing what has brought us to this point, but also seeing the resistance to some of that. Developing a critical consciousness. So we're looking at what are the ways that we are replicating systems of dominance and what are the questions we can ask about it. And you can keep moving. And then obviously, as the name implies, recognize race and confront racism. And then finally create just systems. So this is within the structure of schools, but you can see how readily this goes to any institution and beyond. So next slide, please. So I wanted to, before I tell you about how we're thinking about the summer, I keep going back to this. This is in the epilogue of this significant text. And I use this in a course that I teach called Education in the United States. And, we just ended the class last week. So we end sort of with this notion. An anti-racist America can only be guaranteed if principled anti-racists are in power, and then anti-racist policies become law of the land, and then anti-racist ideas become the common sense of the people, and then anti-racist common sense holds those anti-racist leaders and policies accountable. So, and I put that up there because I know that there is within our church family sort of this like, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And part of what we need to do is to get to the place that this anti-racist idea is common sense. That this is, of course, how we want to live our lives and how we want to build new worlds. And we start with our own community. We start with our own church family. And part of that work, I think, is reading more deeply. Next slide, please. So a couple invitations for you. And I shared this last summer too. I use this a lot. thinking about what will you stop doing, what will you continue doing, what will you start doing as you're reading, as you're taking notes, as you're thinking, as you're having conversations with your family. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of how we're going to do this, I think. Okay.
Oh, yep.
Anybody?
Any questions? Is that what you were asking?
I don't know. I thought I heard somebody talk, so that was my.
Oh.
Well, since nobody did, I'll ask a question. Can
Okay.
we see, I know this is being recorded, but I would love to have access just to the slides to reread them and think about
Oh,
them.
yes. We're going to, in a
Yeah.
moment here, we'll share them, and we're also going to put them in the chat for you, because I put that so that you can have access to everything. Yeah, because I went fast, because who wants to be in school tonight?
But we'll have access
Yes.
after the Zoom is over?
Yes.
Yep, for sure.
Okay,
For sure.
thank you.
So here's how this is going to work. Well, one way that this is going to work. If you're interested in engaging beyond.
Should I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah,
or?
I think so. I think we can
Okay.
and then I'll just talk through. So, hey, Jackie, if you're interested in engaging with when Elizabeth put out in the newsletter 2 weeks ago, that we were going to have a discussion board and places that you go to put some ideas and respond to some things. I am setting up a site. You don't need to know this, but I'm going to tell you the name of it. It's called Canvas. It's the platform that we use through the college. If you're interested in being involved in wanting to do some discussion posts, reading what other people are thinking, because we're all sort of offline, we're all going to be reading at different places at different times, then what I would need from you, we have it in the chat, and Elizabeth, I'm going to pick your brain about the best way to circulate this, but what I need from you is your name and your email. And what will happen then is I will submit a list of your emails, and you will get an invitation to join the pages that I'm setting up. And that's all that is. And then you can go on, you can see what other resources I post. You can see Elizabeth, if she decides she's going to put a discussion prompt for whatever book she's reading, then you can decide that you want to engage with that. And so if I can, I'm just going to show you what you'll see when you get there, so you know what to look for.
And just so you know,
Yeah.
don't worry about clicking any links right now. I'll send an email out.
That's great.
After this or tomorrow, and you guys can do this on your own time and put in your name and your email. So
That's great.
don't fret at the moment.
Yeah. And I had this window open and then I didn't. So if you can just wait a second, just so you know what you're going to see when you go on to the webpage. My dog's going to bark right now because that's what needs to happen, apparently. Sorry about this. It was open and then it was not. So.
While she's working on that, Elizabeth, will you include a list of the books again?
Sure. Yeah, in that email, good idea. I'll put the whole list of the books along with the slideshow link too.
Thank you.
So when you log on, you'll see that you'll get an invitation to join this Reading for Racial Justice page. When you log on, you'll see welcome to the Reading for I'll change that to Racial Justice site. You can click on a link, this link that'll take you to the discussion page. And this link will take you directly to another page that will have other resources, different slideshows, different TED Talks, other things that you might want to engage with. But I just wanted you to know what you were looking for, what that would look like if you choose to get involved with that part of it.
And then when you click on that discussion pages, will there be like different books that you've chosen to read?
Yes. And so I have not set all that up yet. That's why I'm not sharing that page. But yes. And then you can, Elizabeth or Will or whoever's leading that, you can set your own prompt. So
Oh,
it's,
cool.
it doesn't have to be through me, but it'll just, yeah, say that. So that's what we've got. Elizabeth, what else do they need to know?
Yeah. So as you have likely read in various emails, there's a whole list of books that Tara has curated for us. Some even for young families. And you can read just one book this summer, or you could read all of them. You know, we know that this summer is a summer that is a different from last. You know, we're not just stuck at home. So many people are doing their own thing, which is lovely. So that's why we're not doing what we did like with the spiritual autobiographies where we're meeting, you know, regularly together. You can read this on the beach in Maine or in the car on your way to Pennsylvania or whatever, if you're not driving. Or you get an audiobook, for example. I'm sure some of these have audiobooks. So that's why we're calling it a choose your own adventure. And then the hope is when we are all back together in the fall to actually have some in-person conversations about what we've learned over the summer, what we've read, and then do some of our own work to write some racial autobiography, which it's not a requirement, but it can be a kind of a step 2 or part 2 to what we're doing this summer. And you'll hear more about that later. But yeah, it's in the discussion online. If you're interested and if you get the hang of it, can be a great way to hear from other people about what they're thinking. But if that overwhelms you,
Right.
then you can just casually talk to your friends about it offline or just wait until the fall when we're back together. And
yeah, and the other, I guess the other suggestion I would have is if folks want to, folks are around it, they want to have their own mini groups, go for
do it.
Yeah. And, we will have prompts for people to respond to. So you're welcome to use those as your, jumping off point for your conversation. So the idea is everybody needs to recharge in their own way, but we also felt like we didn't want to just, for example, put up the Black Lives Matter banner and then be like, yep, we're good. Which is also just one of the things I was going to say at the beginning of this. One of the disturbing trends is the support for Black Lives Matter between now and last summer has plummeted among white folks. And so that means that we're called even more so to be accomplices, to be co-conspirators, because it's no longer vogue, right? So that I think it's really important for us to continue the work in the different ways that we see fit. And there are definitely, it's not only just reading in the internal work. We do, Elizabeth and I and Andy, before he went on sabbatical, we talked about this, and I feel it too, like I want to do things, right? I don't want to just sit and read, and nothing is stopping you from engaging in the ways that you can and continuing your learning. I think it's important not to think of these as either or. Elizabeth?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that's totally right. And, I would invite you too, as you're reading, if you have ideas of the ways that we as a church can be actively anti-racist in other ways, bring those to the discussion group, bring those to our in-person gatherings in the fall. But we're all on our different journeys. Some of us have been engaging in this work for a really long time. Others are just starting. And so that's what I appreciate, Tara, for bringing these books to us, because we can engage at the various levels that we're at, knowing that it's a really worthwhile endeavor.
Right. So, and I'm, Elizabeth will, when she sends out the information, my contact, she'll also put my email on there if you have separate questions. When and if you decide to join the Canvas page, you run into a problem, we will make it work. So please don't worry about that. We want to make this as accessible and as low hassle as possible. Yeah. So thanks for showing up on, at the end of for me, at the end of a long academic year. So, yeah.
Do you guys have any questions for Tara about, either what you heard her say or just about the program itself? The page.
Yeah, so I'm getting there the pages and discussion pages we can sign up for, check out.
Mhm.
I get that there will be some kind of in-person discussion in the fall.
Mhm.
But there really is no other sort of connection during the summer. I mean, I know it's intentional because people are busy and stuff, but there's really nothing,
Nothing
no
that we're-
questions being sent out or anything.
Well, the discussion board, each of us will be sort of monitoring and responding to that. So we each sort of, like Will and Elizabeth and I have sort of split up the books. So we will be
Right.
responding to that, but we don't have anything else formally planned.
Okay.
But we, this is also a collective. So if folks want to do something, we really encourage them to go ahead. We were sort of figuring out with what my capacity was, what Elizabeth's capacity was, and thinking about the needs of being released from the pandemic too. So
Well, I have to say that because we live in New Hampshire, I'm disappointed that the discussions will all be in the fall. Since we will not be here in the fall, we have enjoyed sharing with you this year, with the church this year, a lot of Zooms. And I don't know whether we can sign up and do something this summer. We had hoped that this would be in-person sort of opportunity for us. But I know you don't want to be the leader, so
yeah. So
I completely,
Yeah.
yeah.
we come out of the academic world. We understand that.
Yeah.
And Sarah, I hope too that, as we're emerging from this pandemic and learning about the ways that people have been engaging with us from afar, like you both and others, that we in the fall, it will look different than just, all right, we're cutting off everyone that has been joining for so long. So we might not get it right the first time, but know that it's going to be, it's very much on our minds about how to keep what we're doing accessible to people who are not in the state or in our zip code. Whether that's we have in-person meetings, but we have a Zoom meeting set up so that those who are far away can join. I know that's not the same as everyone being on Zoom or whatever, but know that that's part of our thought.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Lost my voice. Well, we'll stay tuned. We're not running away.
Good. We're glad that you're here.
Yeah, we are. Anybody else?
Tara, I really appreciate you taking the time tonight at the end of a busy and hard academic year, but also